Good evening, everyone. If you could find your seats. On behalf of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and Northwood University, I would like to thank you for coming out this evening. We have a great event planned for you. I'm going to introduce Ryan Rickel, who will then introduce our guest speaker for the evening. This is the first of a series of events related to our Bowervik essay competition. And Mr. Rickel will be telling you a little bit more details about that. But in addition to this event, we're going to be having a panel discussion and a writing workshop later in the semester, and those dates will be announced. So college students, pay attention, and you'll be welcome at our future events, as will all of you. Ryan Rickel is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's passionate about helping to bring more freedom and opportunity to the people of Michigan and to the nation for making a better future for the next generation. Would you please welcome Ryan Rickel?
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As Dale had mentioned, this is the first of two events supported by the Charles Bowervik Foundation. We'd like to thank Northwood University for hosting. Griswold Center looks great after all the improvements that have been made since the flood. To let you in on the specifics of the essay contest, it is open to all high school students, public school, private school, homeschooled and international students as well. Currently enrolled undergraduate and graduate students from Northwood University. And you college students don't have to worry about losing out to a high schooler because there's two separate tracks. This year, the top prize for the high schoolers has increased to $1,000 for first, $750 for second, and $500 for third place. College prizes are $2,000, $1,500, $1,000, and $500 for fourth place. The prompt for this year's contest will be censorship, fake news, and viewpoints discrimination. What is the role of government versus market forces in enabling free and responsible speech? I encourage everybody to keep that topic in mind during the speech today. Consider what lessons we can take from monopolies and markets and that you can apply to the role of government in enabling free and responsible speech. One last piece of business before I introduce our speaker tonight. There'll be Q&A cards passed down the aisles. They'll be collected by staff towards the end of the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. So now for the man of the hour. He's here to discuss monopolies and free markets. Professor Lawrence Reed is an economist, also a forever optimist, I found out. A historian and president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Freedom in Atlanta, Georgia. Before retiring to his current role in 2019, he was president of the organization for 11 years. Professor Reed was also the first-time full president of the Mackinac Center for 21 years. And prior to the Mackinac Center, he was an econ professor right here at beautiful Northwood University. He's written 7 books, over 2,000 articles and newspaper columns. He's lectured in 50 states and nearly 90 countries, holds 2 honorary doctorates in public administration and in laws from Central Michigan and Northwood. And in 2022, earlier this year, the president of Poland announced he will bestow upon Professor Reed the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. And it's the highest honor that Poland gives to a foreigner. Pretty cool. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Larry Reed.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to be here. And I know it's customary to say something like that at the start of almost every talk, but it has special meaning for me here in this room, on this campus, in this town, because it was 45 years ago, I can hardly believe it, that I pulled up stakes from my native Pennsylvania and moved here to Midland and started teaching right here at Northwood University. And 40 years ago, that I, in this area, ran for Congress. That is so many years ago, I can't even remember if I won. So, but the older you get, it seems like the more that things seem like only 20 years ago. They're 30 or 40 or more. So I'm grateful, as I always have been, to Northwood for helping me get started in my career right out of grad school to come here and begin teaching, which I did for 7 years. And then, as Ryan mentioned, with the Mackinac Center, and I just have so many great memories of people and institutions here in Midland that I miss it very much. And I was telling Bill Schutte how much these last couple days of being around town has reminded me how much I owe Midland and how much I'd like to spend more time here. So I'm planning to come back. I'm not going to wait another 7 or 8 years to come back for another visit. Thank you to the Mackinac Center for sponsoring this event, also the Bowervick Foundation, and to Northwood for providing the venue, and to all of you for coming this evening. The topic I was asked to speak about tonight is a rather academic one, which presents a challenge at 7 o'clock in the evening. And also, it is really a topic that when I taught in this very room, it would take me 2 full class periods to cover. So I've got to condense it into about 30, 35 minutes, and we'll see how well I do that. But this is one of the fascinating episodes in American economic history, the story of the rise of the great Standard Oil Company and the man who built it from scratch, John D. Rockefeller. I think he is, I'll let you know up front where I stand on this, I think he was one of the great heroes of American economic history, and a man whose life lessons have a great deal to teach us all these many decades since he's been gone, over 100 years. But to begin to tell the story of Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller, I have to say a few words about competition and monopoly. I want to give you some definitions of these terms so that we know what we're talking about, because they're often thrown around as if everybody knows what they mean. But I don't think we have the same identical definition from one person to the next. I'm going to give you a definition first of competition that I used to give to my students. And I would tell them that this may sound like a loaded definition, but I'm going to defend it because I think it's eminently defensible. I define competition as striving for excellence in the service of others for self-benefit. Striving for excellence in the service of others for self-benefit. Now that may sound a little odd to you, but let me take it in parts. Striving for excellence. You all know of individuals or institutions or businesses that may for a moment have not seemed to be, quote, very competitive, right? Those are the ones who don't seem to work hard. They kind of sit on their laurels, perhaps, but a truly competitive individual or business or institution is one that strives for excellence. That's the kind of competition that everyone else and every other competitor with this person or institution kind of fears. You know, you'd much prefer to compete with somebody who doesn't strive for excellence because they're easier to beat. But a true competitor strives for excellence because that's the key in a free economy to customers saying, I'll buy your stuff. You're better than the other guy, or you're cheaper, or you're there first, or you're where I need to get the stuff, whatever the advantages may be that he has. Striving for excellence is what a good competitor tries to do. Why does he do it? Well, I said in my definition, striving for excellence in the service of others for self-benefit. Now, we often think of, unfortunately, of people in business who are sort of in it just for the money, as if they're motivated purely by things like greed. There are plenty of people out there who would like you to think that. But a good competitor is going to strive for excellence in the business of providing you with a good or service that you like, that you want, that you'll buy not just once, but repeatedly. So in a sense, he's serving you. And he's doing it because in a free economy, that's the best way to provide for yourself. If you want to do better for yourself, you find a way to make customers happy. So this is why I think the definition I gave you is eminently defensible. Competition means striving to be the best, to do better, cut your costs, cut your prices, serve customers, please other people with your good or service, because that's the way you're going to get ahead. In an unfree economy, let's say a socialized one dominated by those in political power, this may not be the case. Usually, in fact, it's not. You get ahead not by the patronage of willing and happy customers, but rather by what you can take from others using the political process through taxes or special benefits or privileges for you at the expense of other people. Or maybe you put a crown on your head and wrap a robe around you and say, I'm the king, cough it up. You can't do that in a free economy. You have to be there with something that other people want and will buy and buy repeatedly. That's what competition truly means. Monopoly is something that we often think of as whatever it is, it's the opposite of competition, right? But we don't very often run into any kind of hard and fast definition of it. What is monopoly? It's something we're supposed to not like, and I think for good reason. Monopoly suggests the absence of competition. Monopoly suggests somebody is perhaps restricting production instead of increasing it. They're not making customers routinely happy. They're taking their size as an advantage and using it to do some nefarious things or whatever. We have those kind of nebulous conceptions about it. But most economists will tell you that for it to have any meaningful definition, you got to get a lot more specific than that. Some people say, well, monopoly has something to do with the percentage share of a market that you have or that your firm has. And somewhere around 70, 80%, that's too high. We should have antitrust law for the purpose of preventing anyone from having that high of a share. It's very nebulous, but that's actually the way much antitrust law works. It is very nebulous. I can recall one of the more ridiculous lawsuits that was filed by the Federal Trade Commission. It was an antitrust case years ago against the 5 cereal manufacturers in the United States, the companies that made ready-to-eat cereals that you buy in the grocery store in a box. Famous lawsuit that went on for a decade until President Reagan's administration came to office and they just got rid of it. But for a lot of eager beaver antitrust lawyers, they made some money for about a decade. But the suit suggested that General Mills, General Foods, Kellogg, Post, and Quaker, that together they sold 80% of the ready-to-eat cereal in the country. 80%, oh my gosh, that just sounds so high, doesn't it? 80% of the ready-to-eat cereal sold in the country was sold by just these 5 companies combined. That sounds like a big share of the market for a relatively small number of companies, doesn't it? Sounds like, oh, that's monopoly if there ever was one. That's what the FTC claimed in any event. But I remember in this very room asking my students to try to dramatize just how competitive this industry really was. I would ask them, okay, what'd you have for breakfast? How many of you, let me just ask you, how many of you this morning had for breakfast a ready-to-eat cereal out of a box? Cap'n Crunch, right? Okay, good number. How many had no breakfast at all? Oh, well, your competition for, my guess is, Dale, you had bacon and eggs, right? Ryan, I'll bet you had oatmeal. Andrew, I'll bet you had bagels and cream cheese. Where's Dennis Starner? I'll bet you had a Coke and a cigarette. My point is, those five ready-to-eat cereal manufacturers not only competed against themselves, they competed against anybody who made anything that anybody ate for breakfast, even the folks who skipped it altogether. And the idea that they could have some wicked Captain Crunch monopoly was really rather absurd. And so finally that lawsuit was thrown out. I don't think you can define monopoly as a percentage share of the market, because when markets are free, often percentage shares of the market are ephemeral. They don't last very long, and they don't mean a whole lot either if you don't consider all the possible competitive alternatives. I mean, after all, I have a 100% monopoly in the market for lectures by Lawrence Reed, right? 100%. That's as big a monopoly, if that's the way you define the market, as you can get. But I don't have anything close to that in the market for lectures. I'm insignificant. So how you define the market often determines how big you are. And these percentage shares, I think, that are often thrown around should be, you should consider just exactly what the market is before you rush to conclusions. Sometimes people suggest, well, maybe it has to do with the number of competitors. We should have a lot of them. We don't want just a small number, whatever that is, 5 or 10 or whatever. That the number of competitors in the market somehow relates to monopoly, even though that falls far short of any kind of workable definition. How many have ever watched the Miss America pageant? Are they still doing that? Okay, well, you know the idea in any event. They start out with 50 contestants, right? Fierce competition. Do you think when they got down to 5 that the competition felt between the 5 remaining contestants was any less intense than when there were 50? I don't think so. Numbers of competitors don't tell you the whole story, especially if you consider that, yeah, maybe we're down to 5, but what if there is free entry into this market, and if any of those 5 should misbehave and open the door to a newcomer, and now you've got 6, what does that say about the degree of monopoly? I think the best definition of monopoly, the one that applies, that should apply to our analysis of the economy, goes way back to Adam Smith, the father of economics, in his great book of 1776, The Wealth of Nations. He saw monopoly as a government grant of exclusive privilege. Our founding fathers spoke against monopoly, but they meant it in terms of the Adam Smith definition. The Declaration of Independence refers to the British government establishing monopolies by giving special favors to certain businesses, whether they be subsidies or even outright prohibitions for anyone else to enter the market and compete. That was done routinely in the 17th century and before. A government grant of exclusive privilege that is much more easily discovered and defined. But otherwise, if markets are free, I wish we had more time to discuss this tonight, but generally speaking, free markets produce more competition, not less. And you cannot look at conditions in a market at one given moment in time and rush to conclusions, because markets are a dynamic process. You wouldn't stop a horse race in the middle of the race and say, uh-oh, one horse is ahead. We've got to do something. This is, we can't let this horse win the race. Well, it's not over yet. And likewise in free markets, at one given moment, somebody may be ahead. But we have seen corporate mortality in American economic history that would boggle your mind. Companies that are on the top 100 Forbes list in 1950 that have disappeared by 1970. And there are many such examples of that. As long as markets are free, they will be dynamic. And competition can appear not just from an existing firm, but from one that has yet to start its existence. Well, that's important backdrop to what I want to tell you about Rockefeller and John D. Rockefeller's great company, the Standard Oil firm. How many here know, just blurt it out if you know, what Americans were using to light their homes for more than the first half of the 19th century? First half of whale oil. Yeah, it had been used for a long time. We were using whale oil, but by the middle of the 19th century, the supply of whales was diminishing because of the rise in demand for whale oil. We were harvesting whales, but we didn't have the knowledge, the technology really to farm them at that time. So they were common property. We had every incentive to use them and abuse them, but not much ability or technical know-how to husband them, to steward them, to grow the supply. So that caused a reduction in the supply of whale oil, and what do you suppose happened to the price as the decades of the 19th century wear on? It begins to rise. And thank God we did not have a federal Department of Energy at the time to manage that problem into perpetuity. Instead, we allowed markets to work and people began looking for alternatives. When prices rise, a couple things begin to happen. On the demand side, you have people who say, well, it's a little higher today, so maybe I can make do with a little less. I'm sure there were people who thought, maybe I should concentrate my reading during daylight hours, and so I won't have to burn whale oil in the evening. Or somebody may have said, I think I might have some candles in the attic I could dust off and use them. They find ways to do with less. But the more meaningful response in the marketplace, as long as markets are free, comes from the supply side. The search by entrepreneurs for alternatives, something that will fill the gap, something that will allow them to take advantage of these rising prices, provide an alternative, and make a few bucks along the way. We knew for a long time that there was this black oily stuff called oil that was on the surface of creeks, often in northwestern and north central Pennsylvania, not far from where I was born. And we knew the Indians used it for various purposes, but we didn't know for a long time whether this stuff could be commercially viable, whether it could be found and brought forth in large enough quantity and put to good use. We knew that it burned, but it was thanks to a man named Colonel Edwin Drake that at least a couple of those problems were solved. Colonel Drake was sent by a consortium of venture capitalists from Connecticut to Pennsylvania in the 1850s for the purpose of trying to find whether this stuff was in sufficient quantity beneath the earth and could be brought forward and used as lighting. It's a great story because it took place in the little town of Titusville, Pennsylvania. Colonel Drake ran out of the money that his venture capitalists had provided him. They told him, come on home, doesn't look like this is going to work. He was convinced that he was just days away from striking oil and that it would gush forth if he did. And so he went out and borrowed another $500, and that was about gone when he struck oil in 1859 in Titusville. And it truly was a gusher. More than 100 feet tall, the oil burst through. And that began an oil rush first in Pennsylvania, and then it spread to neighboring Ohio. I have seen pictures from Pennsylvania history from the 1860s and 70s of mountainsides that if you look at them from a little bit of a distance, it looks like they're tree covered. And you look closer and you realize, no, those aren't trees, those are derricks. Everybody and his brother was sinking a well, putting a derrick up, hoping to strike this stuff. There was a massive rush to the oil fields as entrepreneurs thought this stuff will take the place of whale oil. Ultimately, it did, and Rockefeller plays a key role in that, which makes him probably the #1 guy in the history of the world to save the whales. I think he saved more whales than Greenpeace by far. Well, John D. Rockefeller enters this picture not as a man of great wealth. He was the guy who started a family of wealth. He was a bookkeeper, a grocer, a Sunday school teacher, and he was alert to entrepreneurial opportunities. And he saw what was happening in Pennsylvania, and he said, I can make a buck out of that. I can help supply the demand and meet this rising price for lighting fuel problem and make a few bucks along the way. In 1865, he had saved enough money, borrowed a bit more, co-founded a partnership in the oil business, and 5 years later, in 1870, he formed the Standard Oil Company. The niche in the market that he was focused on was the refinery end of the market. He didn't so much drill the wells as he refined the oil that came from the wells. And in 1870, the first full year of the Standard Company, he sold 4% of all the refined oil product in the country, almost all of which was kerosene. That was his principal product. That's what we would begin to burn in our homes instead of whale oil. 4% in a year when oil prices were plummeting. Kerosene prices were plummeting. In 1865, kerosene was about 46 cents per gallon. But when he gets into the business, it's about 15 cents a gallon. But because of his ability to cut costs and increase production, he will eventually drive the price to 3 cents a gallon, the cheapest that kerosene has ever been. John D. Rockefeller, we can thank for that, and even though his competitors didn't much care for how he did it well and did it better and more effectively and efficiently than any of the others. Well, in 1890, 20 years after Standard had been founded, Rockefeller has 90% market share. 90% of the kerosene sold in America was from Standard Oil. And that figure and that moment is often seized upon by those of an anti-capitalist persuasion to say, aha, nobody should have a market share that high. Of course he was a monopoly. 90%? How could you justify having 90%? He must have done something awful to competitors. He must have maybe even abused his customers, but somehow nobody should get to 90% of a market or could get that high without having done something nefarious. I want to deal with some of the charges that have been leveled against him, but I also want to remind you that in 1890, when he had 90% of the market, there were 66 other competitors. They were all tiny. Altogether, they only comprised the remaining 10% of the market, but among them were some of the giants of later years. Pure Oil, Sun Oil. They were starting out. Rockefeller was well ahead of them, but they all knew that the moment he slipped up, the moment he gave them the opportunity, they would expand at his expense, and they did. His share of 90% of the market was very short-lived. It would be reduced dramatically long before the Supreme Court rendered a judgment against the company in 1911. More on that later. And it would be reduced by the forces of competition, not by mandates from government, but rather because competitors increasingly made life difficult for John D. Rockefeller. Keep in mind what else was happening too. At the same time that he was growing and providing kerosene to Americans to light their homes, what do you have taking place by the 1880s and 90s that will ultimately remove kerosene from our lives almost altogether? Electricity, right? I mean, that's one of the big competitors to Standard Oil. Certainly it's kerosene monopoly, because increasingly people will say, hey, there's something even better now than kerosene to light our homes. So he had to work to keep his company going in the face of competition from more than just fellow kerosene producers. I think Johnny Rockefeller and Standard Oil could be called the classic efficiency monopoly, which is really no monopoly at all. An efficiency monopoly is simply a company that gets a high market share because it does the best job. Not because of special privileges, not because the government came in and said, we'll side with you and somehow hobble your competition, but rather because he did the best job. He was better than anybody at coaxing kerosene from a barrel of crude. He competed against not just fellow American producers, but the Russians and new oil fields that were coming online from all over the world. He was famous for his cost-cutting expertise. Dr. Bert Folsom, historian who worked here in Midland at the Mackinac Center for 5 years, in his book Empire Builders, talks about how famously, Rockefeller would visit various plants that he owned and study what was happening at each place and see if he could personally find ways to get the job done at lower cost. And one of the ways that he discovered was in the soldering of the metal staves around the barrels that held crude oil. He produced a lot of those. And he discovered that we could get by with 2 fewer drops of solder per barrel. You might think, well, what is that much of a deal? You multiply whatever the cost of 2 drops of solder was by the millions of barrels that he was involved with, that probably was a tidy sum of money. But he was famous for that. And competitors often remarked about how can this guy get more kerosene of better quality out of the same crew that I'm working with than I can possibly get. He knew how to hire the right people. He was a genius at finding the right people and then let them go to town. If you did the job well at Standard Oil, you'd be rewarded, and John D. wanted to keep you around. He didn't have a lot of turnover among the leaders of his company because he was good at picking them and he was good at keeping them by rewarding them for their performance. And that sounds so simple, but it is harder than you think. And there are plenty of businesses that struggle with that every day of the week. Nonetheless, though I've said such good things about him, what about the charges leveled against him that history books routinely provide to students? I want to deal with those one at a time. The first charge, a very popular one against Rockefeller, was that he engaged in predatory price cutting. How many have heard this? Now, this is the idea that being the big guy eventually, he was able to slash prices and go to war, in effect, with his competition. And then in a market devoid of competition after they've all collapsed, he could then raise the price again. That's the idea. There are a couple of ways to deal with this. One is to simply look at the actual fact, the actual record of kerosene prices. If John D. Rockefeller did this, you would expect to see in the record, kerosene prices are not secret, you would expect to see, a big decline in prices and then a big spike in prices. That's what the theory tells us. But there was no such spike. All during the years that he was growing in size and market share, he was cutting the price routinely on an ever-increasing quality product. So the record itself suggests that this is a lot easier said than done, and he probably didn't do it. But the most definitive analysis of this charge goes to Professor John McGee of the University of Chicago, who wrote a path-breaking study in the Journal of Law and Economics, October 1958. He started out with the idea that he had learned that Rockefeller must have done this, and he was going to prove it. Ended up writing an article saying, nope, he didn't do it, and he would have been dumb to even try it. And it's quite a remarkable article. Before I tell you what he said, let me bring it a little closer to home. Just to give you an idea of how difficult predatory price cutting can actually be. It's often presented as, the big guy can do it, piece of cake for him, and he drives all the little guys out. But this idea actually plays a role in the founding of a company you all know from right here in Midland, Dow Chemical. When Herbert Henry Dow started Dow Chemical in 1897, he had major competition to worry about coming from the Germans. He was a scientist, an entrepreneur, and he discovered that through an electrolysis process, he could extract bromine from the very briny water that we have here in the Midland area. And he could do it in a way that was cheaper than the way the Germans were extracting bromine. And he could sell this substance used as a sedative and in the processing of film and some other things. He could sell it and make a profit at a lower price than what the Germans were charging. And they had a cartel. There was a German cartel called the Brom Convention that dominated the world market in bromine. They had set a price of 49 cents per pound, and they did not want anybody undercutting that price. Well, Dow starts making bromine and selling it in Europe and in Asia for 27 cents a pound and making money off of it. And the Germans famously sent a guy to meet with Mr. Dow here in Midland, and he told him that they weren't going to tolerate that if he continued to sell at below their price in all these other markets, that the Germans would put him out of business by slashing the price and dumping the stuff on the markets. And to his credit, Mr. Dow did not take kindly to that and got rid of the guy post haste and started selling in markets wherever the Germans were charging 49 cents and he was charging 27. The Germans thought, okay, we're going to teach him a lesson. So they decided to dump bromine at 15 cents a pound. They figured, we've been around forever, we're big, we've got capital, we got the German government on our side, we can run this little upstart out of business. So they start dumping it at 15 cents, but it's not long before the Germans realize, wow, there's just a tremendous demand from America for this 15-cent bromine. Where's it coming from? Well, Mr. Dow himself sent agents to places like New York to work with the Germans, and without their knowledge that they were working for him. And he told them, you buy all the 15-cent bromine you can get, and we'll just repackage it and sell it in markets wherever the Germans are asking more. And that's what he did. The Germans didn't know where this was coming from, but they thought, oh my gosh, well, we got to keep dumping this stuff, because if we don't sell it, that's just a market for Dow. But it was Dow who was buying the stuff. And finally, the predator, the German cartel, threw in the towel and quit this business, because for them it meant sure disaster. But it was one source of important capital in the early days of the Dow Chemical Company. And the lesson there is that it's a lot easier said than done, this so-called business of predatory price cutting. And there are good reasons for that. As John McGee pointed out in his article, if you're the big guy and you think, I can run the little guys out of business by slashing my price, what's the first thing you have to do with regard to your production once you slash the price? If this is to have any chance of success, what do you have to do with production? You have to produce more, right? If you just produce as much as you were before, you'll just service your current clientele, but you're trying to get the other guy's clientele. So you've got to not only slash the price, but when you do, you've got to dramatically raise production, which means even bigger losses than what you might otherwise have. So the process of running everybody else out of business is very indeterminate. You have no idea how long it's going to take in the meantime. And you might have people like creative entrepreneurs such as Dow finding ways around the problem and stockpiling while prices are cheap, only to find more auspicious times later to sell at a higher price. It's very difficult for the big guy to succeed at this. And the moment that he may think he's beaten the other guys and tries to cash in on the whole process by raising his price, it's like hanging out a sign, competitors want it. The more he raises his price when he thinks the war is over, the more he's going to attract. Some of the people he thought he put out of business are new people who buy up those facilities at a song and can compete now with lower capital costs, or newcomers altogether. Maybe even another big business from a totally different line of work who decide, let's get into this line of work because it's obviously so profitable. So the moment you try to cash in, you are faced with competitive pressures. The predatory price cutting argument has always been a kind of mythical beast. But as John McGee showed, with regard to Standard Oil, it just didn't happen. And you could fault Rockefeller for whatever you want, but don't accuse him of being a dumb entrepreneur. He wouldn't have attempted to do this because he was too smart, and he knew that it likely would lead to trouble for his own company and not the intended outcome that predatory price cutting is supposed to produce. The second charge is that, he got big because he bought out his competitors. And he thereby nipped competition in the bud. He bought out his competition. And there's lots of evidence that he did. You find this often in many industries that, something new starts up, lots of people get into it. Some of them don't even intend to be in it for very long, just make a quick buck and leave it. There's always a consolidation and a reduction in numbers in new industries like this. And sometimes it's cheaper for an existing firm to buy a competitor that's going out of business than it is to create and build new facilities. Rockefeller bought a lot of smaller refineries. The question is, why did he buy them? Did he do it because he thought that was the way to prevent competition? When it appears, you just buy it? If so, if he had 66 other competitors when he had 90% of the market, when prices were at a certain level, how many competitors do you think he would have if he had bought all 66? There'd be another 66 lining up. I mean, again, it's like hanging out a sign, competitors wanted. There's one guy named Daniel P. Reichard who actually worked for Rockefeller. He kind of sensed that Rockefeller might be interested in buying refineries, and so he left Standard and built 3 successive refineries and sold them to Standard, to Rockefeller, without ever having to operate them. That's a pretty easy line of work, right? I don't even have to know how to operate a refinery. I'll just build one and sell it to that guy. The idea that Rockefeller could become big and successful just by buying out, by spending money to crush competition that could never be crushed, sort of suggests that the man was not very bright, but we know he was. A third charge is collusion and conspiracy. Collusion and conspiracy. And it's interesting that in the history books, the same guy has been accused of all these conflicting charges. Which did he do? Did he prey upon his competitors? Did he buy them? Or did he sit down with them and collude and conspire? I mean, how can it be all three? But the idea here is that, well, he must have sat down with his competition and agreed to collude, raise prices and restrict output. I want to walk you through how this might work or not work by imagining that I'm John D. Rockefeller and you're my smaller competitors. And we're at our mountain hideaway, and my purpose is to get you all to agree to my price fixing collusion scheme. Okay? What's the first thing we have to solve if we're going to if we want to get the price higher and make it stick? What's the first problem we have to solve? Production, right? Because if we all produce as much as we did the day before, we're not going to make that higher price stick. To get that price to go up and to stay there, we're going to have to come up with some formula to restrict our production. So to help solve that, I make a proposal. I say to all of you, it's only fair if all of us cut our production by 10%. Everybody does it by a flat 10%. We'll reduce the supply of the market. The price will go up, and then we can keep it high. Are you going to be quick to say, oh, sure, that's fair? You're going to have a million reasons why 10% cut for me is not the same as 10% for you. In fact, if the price is going up, you're going to come up with all kinds of reasons why you should step up your production, not cut it. And so it's going to be very difficult for us to arrive at a formula. But let's say we do. We all agree, okay, you're going to cut 2%, you're going to cut 5%, I'll cut 10%, and so forth. If any of us are really smart, what are we going to do the moment we shake hands on such an agreement? Break it. Yeah. First thing I'm going to do is call your customers. And I'm going to say, hey, Joe is soon going to tell you what your higher price is going to be, but if you don't say anything about it, I'll give you a discount. In other words, the very motivation that led to the creation of the agreement in the first place becomes the motivation for breaking it. And it's the desire to make more money. Because that's what you can do if you break the agreement. If you get the other suckers to restrict their output and raise their prices, then you can undercut that. That's why even the socialist economist or historian, Gabriel Kolko, in his book, The Triumph of Conservatism, he argued that in industry after industry in the late 19th century, there were many attempts to arrive at these collusion type agreements, but he said he couldn't find any that lasted longer than it took for the ink to dry. because a lot of these people entered into the agreement to get the other guy to restrict his production and raise his price with every intent of breaking it at the earliest opportunity. And these agreements tend to break apart for both internal pressures and external. Internally, the companies have agreed to this, discover that it pays to break the agreement. But if they don't immediately break it and they keep that price high, external pressures tend to cause the whole thing to fall apart. And external pressures come from companies that nobody foresaw. They're in another line of work, or they're not even in existence yet. But when they see that high price, they see opportunity. And they say, I hope those guys keep their price high and keep restricting their production. That gives me, as a new competitor, an opportunity. And for those reasons, we've seen, OPEC always has tremendous difficulty. Even though it's a government cartel, it ought to have an easier time making this work, given that it could rely on taxpayers if it has to. But it too finds that collusive price-fixing arrangements don't tend to last very long. They break down for the very reasons that caused them to happen in the first place. I need to work to a period for you to ask questions, so I'm going to wind this up by saying those are the major charges against Rockefeller. They aren't by any means all of them. There was at least one other that you often run into concerning rebates from railroads. I'll just quickly mention that. There are some historians who say, he unfairly got big rebates, the biggest rebates for hauling oil from the railroads, and he put such pressure on them, they had to give him the biggest discounts. But you know why that was the case? Because Rockefeller had the largest quantities of oil to be hauled. He had a lot of leverage in these markets. And he would go to the railroads and say, if you don't cut your price, I'm going to have somebody else haul my oil. And increasingly, he didn't rely upon railroads to haul his oil anyway. He built his own pipelines, which cut his costs even more. The man was a genius at cost cutting and exerting pressure on suppliers to do the best for his firm that they possibly could. So I think Rockefeller is much maligned, and undeservedly so. He should be viewed as a great American entrepreneur who created an industry that wasn't there before. He didn't come into a market and suddenly reduce the supplies of something. He greatly ballooned the supply of product on the market, and he did so in competition with companies and countries all over the world. In my belief, he's a great American entrepreneur. Thank you very much. Oh, okay, there you go. Thanks, Ryan.
All right. We're going to start with the Q&A now.
Okay.
First question here. We hear a lot nowadays about social media companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, having a monopoly. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's in the news a lot these days, isn't it? And you know what concerns me the most about that is not so much the behavior of social media companies as the behavior of social media companies in cahoots with the government. And when Republicans win the House on Tuesday, I hope that will presage some investigations into how agencies like the NSA, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal departments have been colluding with big tech to censor stories. It's that collusion with the government that most concerns me. And if we can prevent the government from engaging in that kind of sanctioning of censorship activities, I think the market in social media will open up. It's already great to see what one man, Elon Musk, can do with just one social media platform in particular, Twitter. You probably saw not only the firings of some of these bad eggs at Twitter that he's done already, but just the other day, the correcting of a White House tweet in which President Biden took credit, claimed that the big Social Security increase for next year is due to his leadership. Would it? Well, it is, yeah, but, but not in the way that he meant. It's a cost of living adjustment. So, I think it was revolutionary for Twitter that it nipped that in the bud. You wouldn't have seen that under the previous guy.
We're going to stick with the social media theme here. It's always difficult to compare history to our current situation, but what similarities do you see between Standard Oil and big tech?
Standard Oil and big tech. I mean, on the good side, you know, these are companies that in the very recent past sprung out of nowhere, created a market and a demand for a product that we didn't even know would be in our future a couple generations ago. They've added, in effect, to the supply of goods and services by creating brand new stuff. That's not really what monopolies tend to do. True monopolies tend to restrict production and restrict output, but they have been expanding and increasing and, by creating platforms and opportunities that didn't previously exist. The problem is that some of these guys at the top have taken their political agendas to the table and in collusion with government have allowed themselves to become big government's censors on behalf of mostly one party. And again, if we can solve that end of it, I'm not very worried about what truly competitive social media platforms can do to you in a genuinely free market. I think it's the collusion with government that is the source of the problem.
Great. Can you hold up your cards so the staff can see them if you have any more, please, before I ask this next question? Here's a good one right here. If customers benefit, why is the issue monopolistic?
If customers benefit, why?
Why is it considered a monopoly?
Any particular company or?
Nope.
Oh.
Just in general. In general.
Well, this is a good question for the Eager Beaver antitrust folks, I think. You know, I don't remember very many people complaining about Captain Crunch or cornflakes when the FTC went after the cereal manufacturers. And this is often the problem. You know, the complaints come not from consumers quite frequently that lead to an antitrust suit. The complaints come from competitors who don't like the idea of having to compete with this big guy or this smarter guy. Or they come from another country maybe who think they can use our laws to stifle American competition. I hope that answers that question.
Do you think there is a making of a monopoly in the entertainment industry? For example, Walt Disney Company.
Boy, that's hard for me to see. When you think of all the ways in which I mean, these are companies like Disney that are, yeah, they're in the filmmaking business, but more broadly, they're in the entertainment industry. And I don't know about you, but I find a lot of different ways to be entertained. It isn't just watching a Disney movie. So the competition to be entertained, I think, is pretty vast. And if they ever got to where their stuff was no longer entertaining, I think all these other options would blossom.
Okay. How bad do you believe the impact of government interference is on the marketplace? You could use a 1 to 10 scale, percentage scale.
Oh, it's one of the biggest issues of our day. And where do we start? I mean, there are so many endless ways in which government impedes creative, productive people. I'll just cite a few. A lot of folks think the minimum wage is a good idea, that somehow it makes sure that people at the lower end of the economic ladder do better. But economists, most of them, any that are worth their salt, will tell you that the minimum wage only hurts the people it is intended to help. It prices the unskilled and the inexperienced out of the labor market. If the minimum wage made any sense at $7.50 an hour, or as some want, $15 an hour, why would we settle for such low figures? Why not declare a minimum wage of $50 an hour? The fact is, the higher you set a minimum wage, the less demand there will be for workers, especially those whose services are not yet in their life worth what Congress designates. You cannot make a person worth a certain amount by making it illegal to pay him any less. You're not automatically worth what Congress decrees just because they decree it. Your worth is determined by your productivity, your skills, your talents, your references, your abilities, not some artificial mandate from Congress. And that's just one way. We hurt the people that the law is itself supposed to help. You name it. If I could get rid of entire departments of government, I would go back to what President Reagan advocated in 1980. He said, we don't need a Department of Education, and we don't need a Department of Energy. Maybe we don't need a Department of Commerce either. But believe it or not, energy and education only came our way under Jimmy Carter. And he's still around. Somehow we managed to get through energy issues and education issues just fine without federal departments. And yet we've, in the years since, spent a fortune of taxpayer money in both areas with very little to show for it, especially the Department of Education. And that consumes, what, $100 billion now? If you got rid of that department tonight and had cut that $100 billion entirely, nothing but good would result. They don't educate anybody. They just pile on the mandates. They tell teachers what they ought to do when teachers know best because they're in the classroom. But that's just the beginning. There's a laundry list I could give you of ways in which government burdens us.
All right, we got time for 2 more quick ones.
Okay.
Please comment on the term robber barons. Was John D. Rockefeller one? Who, if anyone, was an evil robber baron?
I think it was a guy named Matthew Josephson, a historian, who was very anti-capitalist, very anti-free market, who first coined that term. And he meant it as a broad epithet against people that made their fortunes in markets in the late 19th century and who he thought were motivated by pure greed and a desire to crush their competition and somehow harm their customers. It's very unfortunate that it took hold. And of course, in the years since, people of a Marxist persuasion have picked up on that and used it a lot. I love, by the way, what British historian Paul Johnson tells us that Karl Marx's mother once said about her son Karl. It's the ultimate put down, I think. In his book Intellectuals, Johnson actually footnotes this and cites the source, but apparently Karl Marx's mother once said that she wished that her son Karl would accumulate some capital instead of just writing about it. Can you just imagine? He's scribbling away, and she's telling him, why don't you get out and get a job? Anyway, but there's an anti-capitalist ethic that runs through many societies. It's very unfortunate. There's a desire that is innate in so many humans to be envious of others. And a lot of this robber baron stuff comes from that. I'm envious of someone who has more than me, who succeeded better than I did, who seems to have succeeded at somebody else's expense, fictitious or not. And that's very unfortunate. The world will be a better place when we get over that someday and judge people by their character and their performance and not by the size of their bank account. But it's a constant struggle. There are a lot of people who are motivated by envy, and they don't like the fact that some people have succeeded to an extent greater than they have. That's very unfortunate. I don't know about you, but I love to see people succeed. More power to them. And I think that should be our attitude. If we want to live better, we want people who know how to make life better to succeed at doing it. Through invention, through innovation, through production, through employment, the things that entrepreneurs do. So it's a very loaded term. Oh, you also asked who would be an example of a genuinely bad robber baron. I'll give you one from the private sector, just so you don't think that I'm so biased that I don't see any bad guys in the private sector. Jay Gould was an entrepreneur who made his money in railroads and other lines of work in the late 19th century. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had made his money in the steamship business, then turned his eye to railroads, wanted to buy a railroad that Jay Gould was a big owner of with other investors, the Erie Railroad. And so Vanderbilt, who would likely have been a better manager of the Erie, had more experience, more intent on running a good railroad than just milking one dry, as Jay Gould did. He started buying stock in the Erie, hoping he could get to the point where he could oust Jay Gould and run the company better. Jay Gould went to the New York State Legislature and got approval, because that's where the Erie was chartered, to start printing up additional shares of stock and flooding the market with it, so that the more Vanderbilt bought, the less actually the share of ownership he actually had. And he never was able to get a hold of the Erie, and Jay Gould milked it dry. Now there's a robber baron who was able to do the nefarious thing he set out to do because of an alliance with the powers that be, with, in that case, the New York legislature. And that's what makes monopoly truly dangerous, when it's allied with the police power of government. So he'd be one of my leading examples of one.
All right, one last question in closing here. It's a good one. What is one piece of advice you have for us college students?
Oh, that's easy. Over the years, I've written a great deal about this in the last 15 years. I've come to the conclusion that the most important thing in society, the most important thing for you personally, the most important issue in the country, every time somebody says to me, what do you think the biggest issue in the country is, they expect me to say taxes or opioids or debt or spending or whatever, crime. And I say, no, it's one thing. And it's the same as it's always been, here and everywhere. And that number one issue is character. Everything else flows from it. If a country doesn't get that right, if you as a person don't get that right, almost nothing else is going to matter. You could reform the world if we all reformed ourselves. It would probably be more effective at accomplishing our objective than if we went out to try to reform the world first. So I tell audiences of young people in particular, get your character right, because everything else flows from it. And that means such things as learning the importance of truth and sticking by it, defending it, not shading it, cutting corners, prevaricating, but instead make honesty and truth top priorities in your life. You'll never regret that. You may have to pass up certain opportunities that seem to come your way for some short-term benefit by fudging the truth a little bit, but if you have a conscience, that's going to bother you. But I think we all should someday want to go to our Maker, being able to look back and say, I may not have been perfect, but once I knew the importance of character, I worked on it every day. And one of those pillars was to be faithful to the truth, to be honest. But there are other character traits too. I'll just quickly mention a few. Another is humility. I think we should want a society where people are humble enough to realize how little they know. If you live in a society full of know-it-alls, busybodies, people who think they know everything, you're going to be in constant strife. The founder of our Foundation for Economic Education wrote a little essay years ago called I Pencil. How many have read that? Okay. And it's the story of how a pencil comes into being, as told by the pencil itself. And the pencil explains, well, at the top of me, the eraser comes from a certain plant in Malaysia, and the graphite comes from beneath the ground, and the wood, certain trees work better than others. And he explains that he is the result not of some central command from on high, but from individuals with a myriad of skills and talents from all over the world, guided by the price system, the profit motive, coming together as if by magic in producing a pencil. And yet not a single one of them could do it entirely by himself. It's amazing when you think of it. If I told you go out and make a pencil without relying upon the knowledge, the skills, or talents of anybody else, just what you know, period, and that's it. Nothing else. You have to make it yourself. Everything about it. You couldn't do it. That's how difficult it would be. So what does that say about the ability of a handful of people to plan an economy? You know, anytime I run into folks, university faculties, where I run into them most often, who think they're smart enough to plan an economy, I'd like to point out to them, you don't even know how to make a pencil. You need to learn a little humility from a simple writing implement called a pencil. Humility, I think, makes people, if you're humble, you become more introspective. You think in terms of, instead of reforming the world, maybe I should reform myself. How can I improve? There's so much knowledge out there I don't know and will never know. I can't be a know-it-all, so why not improve myself rather than think I can plan somebody else's life? That's an important character trait, as is responsibility. Stepping up to the plate and not blaming others for your mistakes. Courage, standing up for what you know to be right, not running from a fight when principles that are eternal are involved. Things like gratitude is another important character trait. And this is one, I think it's ever more obvious that we're losing this in our society. Gratitude, the idea of having a grateful spirit, a thankful spirit. I find myself, I'd be interested if you find yourself in the same position, increasingly wanting to say to people, you're welcome, even though they never said thank you. You know what I'm talking about? But I refrain from doing that. And I often see parents who have missed an opportunity to instruct a child to say thank you for something. Gratitude is nothing less than the acknowledgement that at least some of the good things that have happened to you are not entirely of your doing, that somebody else was involved. And saying thank you for it is a pretty cheap way of encouraging that good activity. You don't see that much on the left either, do you? Have you noticed that? The example I like to use is, can you imagine Karl Marx, angry leftist, going into a hardware store and saying to the storekeeper, hey, thanks so much for investing in this place and taking a risk and hiring people and paying them a wage and producing products on the shelf so reliably that every time I need something, I know it's there. Thanks for doing all that for all of us. He wouldn't do that, nor would most leftists today, because they are angry. They're not grateful people. And yet, if you look around and open your eyes, there is so much that we should be awestruck about every day and be thankful for. And so many times when we should say thanks to someone who did something, but we fail to do so. These are elements of strong character. So the answer to your question is, make your personal character the highest priority. And someday you will look back and be able to say, I left the world a better place than I found it because I focused on character, and others will thank you for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. Dale, Northwood University, great venue. I wanted to just touch on the Bauervik Foundation again. Thank you to them as well. The essays will be due, registration, ends on the 15th. Essays will be due March 1st. Winners announced in mid-March. For anyone that needs help or would like to learn a little bit, the Mackinac Center and Northwood University will be having a workshop January 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. at the McNair Center. We'll send out emails to everybody. Thanks everybody for coming.